Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to our latest stories. Before I start, tell me where you are watching me from. I wonder which cities and towns will join me in this memory that will follow me for years. It started on one of those quiet afternoons when the air feels heavier than usual, not from heat, but from thought. The kind of day when you can hear the ticking of the clock echo through the walls, and every sound feels louder simply because you're alone. I was sitting by the kitchen window, stirring a cup of tea I didn't really plan to drink, just watching the autumn leaves fall one by one across the yard. That's when I heard the knock. Not a hurried one, not uncertain either, a slow, steady knock. It was Mr. Wilson, my neighbor from 2 doors down. He's lived there for years, though truth be told, we'd never really talked beyond polite greetings and short conversations about the weather or the trash pickup schedule. He was one of those people who always seemed to have something quietly heavy in their eyes, the kind of look you don't forget, even if you don't know the story behind it. I opened the door, and he smiled, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," he said, holding out a small box. "I was clearing the attic and found something I think might belong to you." I blinked, a little surprised. "To me?" He nodded and stepped closer, holding out the box. It was an old tin one, the kind you'd expect to hold sewing needles or small family keepsakes. My name was written faintly on the side, in handwriting I hadn't seen in decades. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice quieter than I expected. He explained that years ago, his wife, before she passed, used to collect small things from the neighborhood garage sales. Apparently, she had bought a box of random items from mine, and this had somehow ended up mixed in. He'd only found it now, while cleaning out her old things. I took it, my fingers trembling slightly as I lifted the lid. Inside were letters, ones I had written to my sister when we were both still young, both still believing that life would unfold exactly as we wanted it to. I hadn't seen those letters since my 20s. The sight of my own handwriting, the way I used to curve my Y and cross my T, it was like meeting a younger version of myself again. He didn't leave. Maybe he sensed that something in me had shifted, or maybe he needed the company as much as I did. Either way, I asked if he wanted tea, and he said yes, in that gentle way people say it when they're grateful not to be alone. We sat at my kitchen table, the one with the small crack down the middle that I keep meaning to fix. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the trees were bending softly under it. He asked about my sister, and I found myself telling him more than I usually tell anyone. About how she'd moved away years ago, how we'd lost touch for reasons too complicated to sum up in one sentence. About how I sometimes still thought of calling her, even though I wasn't sure she'd answer. He listened, really listened, in that patient way people rarely do anymore. When he spoke, it wasn't to give advice, but to share his own quiet truths. He talked about his late wife, how she used to hum while cooking, how her absence had changed the way silence sounded in his house. It wasn't sadness that filled his voice, it was memory, heavy but soft. We talked for what felt like hours, but time didn't seem to matter. The light outside shifted from gold to grey, and the kitchen began to glow with the soft hum of evening. At one point, I caught myself laughing, a genuine laugh, not the polite one you give in conversation. And I realized I hadn't laughed like that in a long while. Before he left, he looked around the room, not out of curiosity, but almost as if memorizing it. "You know," he said, "it's strange how some things find their way back to where they belong." I nodded, though I wasn't sure whether he was talking about the box, or something else entirely. After he walked out, I stayed sitting there, staring at that little tin box and the faded letters inside it. They smelled faintly of dust and time, and maybe of forgiveness. For a while, I just sat quietly, letting the stillness wrap around me. There was something comforting about it, something honest. That night, I placed the box on my nightstand. I didn't open the letters again, not yet. But knowing they were there, that a part of me, a forgotten part, had found its way home, made the room feel warmer somehow. And as I lay in bed, I thought about how life has this way of bringing people to your door exactly when you need them most, even if you don't realize it until later. That evening, Mr. Wilson's visit didn't just return a piece of my past, it reminded me that sometimes, unexpected connections are what quietly hold us together when everything else feels like it's falling apart. Tomorrow, I told myself, I'd bake something and take it over to his house. Maybe just a thank you, maybe something more. I didn't know yet. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wanted to find out. The next morning began quietly. The kind of morning that feels washed clean after a night of rain, fresh, calm, a little fragile. The sky was still grey, and the scent of damp earth drifted through the cracked window. I woke up earlier than usual, maybe because I had something on my mind. That box. Those letters. And, truthfully, Mr. Wilson. I made a pot of tea and stood by the counter, staring at the tin box on the table. I had thought I would read the letters again right away, but now I hesitated. Maybe I was afraid of what I'd feel, the weight of remembering too much at once. Instead, I decided to do something simple, something kind. I took out some flour, butter, and sugar, and began to bake. It had been years since I'd made my old lemon cake recipe. The one my sister and I used to make together every spring, when everything seemed possible. As I whisked the batter, I caught myself humming, quietly, absent-mindedly, the same way his wife used to, he'd said. It made me smile. By the time the cake came out golden and fragrant, I felt something settle in me. Not peace exactly, but a quiet steadiness. I cut 2 slices, placed them on a plate, and carried them over to Mr. Wilson's house. His house looked the same as always, neat but touched with time. The porch steps creaked slightly as I climbed them. When he opened the door, he looked surprised, though his face softened quickly. "You didn't have to," he said, his eyes lighting up a little when he saw the cake. "I know," I replied, "but I wanted to." He invited me in. The inside of his home smelled faintly of cedar and old books, a comforting scent that reminded me of libraries and quiet Sunday afternoons. The walls were lined with framed photographs, his wife, smiling, holding a garden spade, his grown children, and a few black and white ones I guessed were from much earlier. There was something tender in how everything had been left just so, as if time had paused there out of respect. We sat by the window in his small dining room, sharing the cake and more conversation. It started lightly, about the weather, the neighborhood, the way the street had changed over the years. But as the minutes passed, the tone softened, deepened. He told me how he and his wife had moved there nearly 40 years ago, right after their wedding. How they'd built the garden together, tree by tree, flower by flower. He spoke with that distant warmth people have when they talk about something precious but unreachable. When I asked how he managed after she passed, he paused. I didn't, not really. For a while, I just existed. You know, going through the motions. He smiled faintly, looking down at his hands. But lately it's felt different. Not easier, but quieter. I understood that. I'd been through my own kind of loss, not death, but distance. Sometimes absence feels the same no matter the cause. He asked if I'd ever thought of reaching out to my sister again. The question lingered between us for a moment. I have, I admitted, but I always stop myself. Too much time has passed. What would I even say? He looked thoughtful. Maybe you don't need to know what to say. Maybe you just start. Sometimes that's enough. His words stayed with me long after I left. That afternoon, I sat by my window again, watching as the light shifted and the leaves turned copper in the fading sun. I pulled the letters closer, untied the ribbon, and finally began to read. The handwriting felt strange at first, so familiar yet foreign. My younger self had written with so much certainty, so much hope. Each letter was filled with dreams, laughter, even small fights we'd had. But near the end, they grew quieter, shorter, and finally stopped altogether. When I finished, I didn't cry. I just sat there, my fingers resting on the paper, feeling both younger and older all at once. As evening came, I glanced out the window and saw a light flicker on in Mr. Wilson's kitchen. It made me smile without meaning to. There was comfort in knowing someone else was awake, just there close enough to feel like company, even in silence. That night, I took out a blank sheet of paper. It felt strange to write a letter again after so many years, but I began anyway. Not perfect, not polished, just honest. I told my sister about the box, about the letters, about how someone kind had unknowingly brought a piece of us back to me. When I was done, I sealed the envelope but didn't address it yet. I wanted to wait, to think, to be sure. But for the first time in years, the idea of reconnecting didn't feel impossible. As I turned off the light, I thought of Mr. Wilson's words, some things find their way back. Maybe people do too. Maybe it just takes time, and a little courage. The letter sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I finally sent it. Every morning I'd glance at it, pick it up, reread the first few lines, then put it down again. Maybe it was fear, not of rejection, but of reopening something I'd learned to live without. But on the 4th morning, as the sun poured through the curtains, warm and sure, I decided it was time. I slipped on my coat, walked down to the post office, and dropped the letter into the slot before I could talk myself out of it. When I stepped back onto the street, the air felt lighter. Sometimes, it's not the answer that changes things, it's the act of finally reaching out. That evening, I saw Mr. Wilson again. He was outside trimming the hedges, wearing that old beige sweater I'd come to recognize from afar. I walked over, carrying a small jar of homemade jam I'd made the day before. He smiled when he saw me, setting down the shears. "Lemon cake and now jam? You're spoiling me," he teased softly. "Maybe," I said, "but I think we both needed a little spoiling." We sat on his porch, the air cool and crisp, smelling faintly of pine. The sun was setting behind the rooftops, painting everything in soft gold. He poured us both a cup of coffee, and we talked the way people do when silence isn't uncomfortable anymore. He asked about the letters again, and I told him I'd sent one to my sister. He nodded, pleased, but didn't pry. Instead, he told me how he used to write to his wife when she traveled to visit their daughter. "I still keep them all," he said, gazing out toward his garden. "Even the ones where we argued in ink." There was a quiet truth in that love, in any form, isn't erased by time. It simply changes shape. As the sky deepened to a dusky blue, the porch light flickered on. I noticed an old bird feeder hanging near the steps, empty and rusted. "You used to feed the birds?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "She did. Every morning, without fail. They still come sometimes, out of habit, I suppose. I just haven't gotten around to filling it." The next morning, I brought over a small bag of seed. I didn't say anything, I just filled the feeder quietly while he was in the garden. When he saw me, he chuckled. "You don't waste any time, do you? Someone has to keep your visitors fed," I said, nodding toward the sparrows waiting in the branches, and so began a gentle routine. Some mornings, he'd wave from his porch as I passed by on my way to the store. Other days, he'd stop by with something simple, a jar of honey, a newspaper article he thought I'd like. Nothing grand, but meaningful in the way only small gestures can be. Weeks passed like that, comfortably, naturally. Then one afternoon, as I was pruning my roses, I heard him call my name. There was a letter in his hand, mine. He smiled softly as he handed it to me. "This came for you. Looks like someone's been waiting a long time to reply." My heart stopped for a moment. The return address was familiar, too familiar. My sister's. I thanked him, though my voice caught halfway through. He didn't ask questions. He simply said, "Whatever it says, read it when you're ready." I read it that night, sitting in the same spot where I'd once stared at the old tin box. Her handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. The letter wasn't long, but every line felt like a heartbeat. She wrote that she'd thought of me often, more than she ever said out loud. That she'd kept my old letters, too, tucked away in a drawer she couldn't bear to open for years. And at the end, she wrote, "I'd like to see you again if you're ready." I didn't realize I was crying until I saw the drops on the paper. They weren't sad tears, not entirely. More like release. The next morning, I went to see Mr. Wilson. He was sitting on his porch, wrapped in a blanket, sipping his coffee. When he saw me, he smiled, that quiet, understanding smile of his. "She wrote back," I said simply. He nodded. "And? She wants to see me." He didn't speak right away. Instead, he gestured to the chair beside him. "Then you should go," he said after a moment. "Sometimes the hardest journeys are the ones that take us back home." I sat beside him, letting the weight of his words sink in. We didn't talk much after that. We just watched the morning light spill across the yard, the way it made everything look softer. Later that day, I began to pack, not much, just a small bag. I wasn't sure how long I'd stay, or what I'd say when I saw her. But I knew I had to go. Before I left, I walked over to his porch once more. "I'll be gone a few days," I told him. "I'll keep the birds company," he said with a smile. Then, after a pause, "And I'll be right here when you get back." That promise, quiet as it was, meant more than I could put into words. As I drove away the next morning, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was standing on his porch, hand raised slightly, watching until I turned the corner. For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone on the road ahead. I felt connected to the past, to what I'd lost, and maybe, to what I was still meant to find. The drive to my sister's town felt longer than it used to, though it wasn't really the distance, it was the years between us that stretched the road. As I passed the familiar bends and bridges, memories returned in fragments, us as girls running barefoot through summer fields, her laughter echoing through the air, the way she used to braid my hair before school. The past came back not as sharp pain, but as a soft ache, the kind that reminds you you've lived, and loved, and lost your way somewhere along the line. When I finally reached her house, I sat in the car for a few minutes, just watching. The garden looked different, new flowers, a fresh coat of paint on the fence, but the old oak tree was still there, its roots deep and strong. I took a breath and walked to the door. She opened it before I could knock. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Her hair had more silver now, her eyes a little softer. But beneath all that, she was still her, the same sister I'd grown up with, the same person I'd missed in quiet ways for far too long. Then she smiled, small at first, then wider, and said my name. Just hearing it from her, after so many years, felt like coming home. We didn't talk about the time lost, not right away. Instead, we sat at her kitchen table, much like I had with Mr. Wilson weeks before. She poured us both tea, and the steam rose between us like a bridge slowly being rebuilt. I kept your letters, she said softly, looking down at her cup. All of them. Even the ones that hurt. So did I replied. She nodded, her eyes glistening. I should have called you sooner. I shook my head. We both could have. And that was enough. There was no need for blame, only the quiet understanding that life, in all its unpredictability, had given us a second chance. We spent the next few days together, walking through her garden, cooking meals that tasted like childhood, laughing at old stories neither of us had forgotten. Each moment felt like reclaiming something precious we'd thought was gone. On the third day, she found the courage to ask, "What made you reach out after all this time?" And I told her the truth about the box, about the letters, about the man who had unknowingly brought them back to me. She smiled thoughtfully. Sounds like someone special. He is, I said. In a quiet kind of way. When I returned home a few days later, the first thing I noticed was the bird feeder. It was full, and the air was alive with chirping. Mr. Wilson had kept his promise. I smiled as I walked up the path, feeling an unexpected sense of peace settle over me. He was on his porch, as always, a book in his hands. When he saw me, he stood up slowly, smiling that familiar, gentle smile. Welcome back, he said. Thank you, I replied. And thank you for watching the birds. They missed you, he said, and we both laughed. We sat together again, this time not as neighbors bound by coincidence, but as friends bound by understanding. I told him about my sister, about the visit, the laughter, the feeling of forgiveness. He listened, eyes steady and kind. When I finished, he said, "Funny how one small box could carry so much." Yes, I said, glancing toward the sunset. It carried more than I ever expected. For a while, we just sat in silence, watching the sky change colors, gold to pink, pink to blue. The world felt softer somehow, fuller. I realized then that this chapter of my life wasn't about endings or regrets. It was about rediscovery, of family, of peace, of connection. As I got up to leave, he said something that stayed with me. You know, sometimes life gives us back what we lost, but in different forms. You found your sister again. And maybe I found a friend. I smiled. Maybe you did. That night, I placed the tin box back on my nightstand. Not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder that healing can begin from the smallest acts, that kindness can come from unexpected places, and that even the quietest connections can change the course of a life. The next morning, I wrote another letter, not to my sister this time, but to myself. I wrote that it's never too late to reach out, to forgive, to begin again. Then I placed it inside the box, alongside the old ones, letting it become part of the story that had found its way home. And every time I glance out my window now and see Mr. Wilson feeding the birds, I remember that some visits, even the simplest ones, can turn into the kind of memories that follow us for years.